Between 1664 and 1763, over 8,000 members of the Iroquois Confederation vanished from the record, not through battlefield losses, not through mass migrations, but through disease outbreaks timed with diplomatic encounters. The official explanations, preserved in colonial archives, describe them as inevitable casualties of nature, but recently unsealed files tell another story, outbreaks that aligned too closely with the arrival of British medical officers, shipments of humanitarian supplies, and carefully catalogued notes on infection rates. Documents reveal that blankets from smallpox hospitals were redirected into the very villages targeted for aid. These shipments were disguised as gifts, an ancient diplomatic tradition perverted into a weapon. Survivors later described the horror in terms more haunting than any military raid. Children blistered in the night, elders withered in silence. Villages that once stood as symbols of Iroquois strength collapsed into mass burial grounds. No British musket was raised, no cannon fired, yet territories emptied in weeks. Archaeological findings confirm the sudden abandonment of fortified longhouses, their hearths cold, their tools left behind, as if life ended mid-motion. Wherever you are listening from, New York, Pennsylvania, or beyond, remember, the land beneath you carries the memory of these vanished villages. The rivers that once reflected the our light of Iroquois councils now conceal a silence engineered in medical offices and colonial courts. You are listening to Fear Classified. This is not folklore, and it is not speculation. These are records, fragments, and testimonies assembled from the archives they never expected you to see. Subscribe and join our community of listeners as we investigate the dark mechanics of institutional conspiracies, where medicine, diplomacy, and empire converge to erase entire peoples from history. The collapse of the Iroquois Confederation was not a mystery of politics or culture. It was the first large-scale trial of biological warfare on the North American continent, and what was tested here was later perfected. The story begins long before the first blanket was handed over, within the political machinery of empire where reform and conquest wore the same mask. The Iroquois Confederation, known to its people as the Haudenosaunee, or People of the Longhouse, was not a fractured collection of villages, but a sophisticated political system established centuries before European colonization. Composed of the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, and later joined by the Tuscarora, the Confederation was built upon the great law of peace, a framework of shared governance, collective defense, and careful diplomacy. In the mid-17th century, their territories stretched across the valleys of present-day New York and Pennsylvania, anchoring the fur trade routes and commanding rivers that fed the Atlantic world's economy. To the British Crown, the Iroquois were more than neighbors. They were a rival empire in miniature. Their councils could unite thousands of warriors. Their alliances spanned from the Great Lakes to the Chesapeake, and their diplomatic reach forced European powers to recognize them as equals in negotiation. Yet this balance carried an unspoken threat, an indigenous political union strong enough to disrupt imperial control. By 1664, Britain had seized New Amsterdam from the Dutch, renaming it New York and planting a strategic foothold on Iroquois borders. From that point forward, colonial administrators sought to extend influence not just through arms but through institutions. Trade posts became embassies, mission schools became centers of surveillance. Most importantly, medicine became diplomacy. The British Colonial Medical Service, though primitive in infrastructure, was expanding in mandate. Originally designed to safeguard colonial garrisons from tropical diseases, it soon positioned itself as a tool of political leverage. Medical officers accompanied diplomats, appearing in villages as benevolent figures bearing remedies, ointments, and surgical instruments. Their presence was presented as goodwill. The empire, his scientific knowledge offered to native populations in exchange for loyalty and peace. Behind this veneer lay another reality. Documents reveal that by the late 17th century, the service was already compiling reports on the effects of smallpox, measles, and influenza on native constitutions. The reports classified indigenous susceptibility as data, quantifying how epidemics could clear territories faster than any regiment of soldiers. In the mid-18th century, William Johnson rose as the empire's most influential figure in Iroquois affairs. Appointed Superintendent of Indian Affairs in 1756, Johnson cultivated a reputation as both ally and mediator, marrying into Mohawk kinship networks while simultaneously serving imperial objectives. Johnson's correspondence with the crown is filled with the language of diplomacy, yet his private ledgers betray a harsher calculus. He quantified populations in terms of effectives, noting how many warriors each nation could field. He tracked mortality rates during epidemics, cross-referencing them with the distribution of British gifts. To Johnson, every epidemic was an opportunity, a weakening of resistance that made negotiations easier, land transfers smoother, and military alliances more malleable. He was not a physician, but his work relied upon the data collected by those who were, men like Surgeon General John Pringle. Pringle, later celebrated as the father of military hygiene, is often remembered for his advancements in battlefield sanitation. Yet buried within his career are disturbing contradictions. While publicly advocating for humane treatment of soldiers and prisoners of war, his private memoranda from the colonies treat disease as a weapon of control. Pringle's early postings exposed him to the devastation of smallpox. He observed how outbreaks disproportionately annihilated indigenous communities while leaving European regiments comparatively intact, thanks to variolation practices already spreading among colonists. To Pringle, this was not tragedy but pattern recognition. His writings catalogued how entire villages could be incapacitated within weeks, how social cohesion unraveled under epidemic stress, and how survivors carried deep psychological scars that made them easier to subjugate. According to sealed files, Pringle considered indigenous populations unfit for long-term integration and instead recommended policies of attenuation, a euphemism for reducing numbers until political threat collapsed. Disease, he suggested, was the most cost-effective method. To the Iroquois, healing traditions were sacred. Herbalists, midwives, and spiritual leaders preserved an intricate pharmacopoeia drawn from forests, rivers, and animal knowledge. The arrival of British physicians, therefore, was not immediately distrusted. Remedies against fevers, surgical interventions, and supplies of linen were initially welcomed as additions to their own systems, but the relationship shifted as outbreaks grew synchronized with the presence of these physicians. Villages that received medical gifts often became the epicenters of epidemics. Blankets, ointments, and even medical instruments left behind carried contagion. Survivors later described the betrayal, how physicians who once bound wounds returned weeks later to find entire families dead, their own hands clean of responsibility. Missionaries framed the deaths as providence, urging conversion and dependence. Diplomats framed them as natural misfortune, pressing for new treaties while grief still silenced resistance. The trust placed in medicine, a bridge of peace, was turned into a weapon sharper than any blade. Britain was not alone in recognizing the utility of disease. French colonial officers in Canada also documented epidemics among their indigenous allies, noting how the decline of rival populations created openings for French expansion. Yet the British system was distinct in its bureaucratic prescience. The empire relied on records, ledgers, and reports. Each epidemic was logged, each death tallied, each community collapse entered into files that circulated between medical offices and colonial courts. Over time, these records reveal an unmistakable trajectory. Disease deployed not as accident, but as policy. The 7 Years' War, fought between 1756 and 1763, became the crucible for these tactics. British forces, stretched thin against French armies and their indigenous allies, turned increasingly to biological advantage. Outbreaks during campaigns were often described as fortuitous, yet correspondence shows how supplies from infected hospitals were redirected to contested zones. By war's end, entire Iroquois towns lay empty, their political influence reduced to shadow. Publicly, colonial reformers framed their efforts as protection and progress. pamphlets described the medical service as proof of Britain's civilizing mission. Reports to Parliament emphasized the generosity of distributing linen, food, and medical care. Newspapers praised the remarkable fortune of epidemics that weakened enemies before battle. Privately, the system relied on concealment. Records of blanket shipments were hidden under the category of diplomatic gifts. Mortality statistics were adjusted to appear as natural variation. Pringle's memoranda were sanitized before entering official archives, leaving only fragments in coded language. This two-tiered narrative, benevolence on the surface, biological calculation beneath, formed the template for future colonial medical policy across the empire. Despite catastrophic losses, the Haudenosaunee were not passive victims. Councils recorded in oral tradition recall debates over whether to continue accepting British gifts. Some villages burned the supplies outright, suspecting their danger. Herbalists experimented with new remedies, combining traditional medicine with observations of European practices. The record of the first deliberate incident emerges not in a battlefield report, but in the form of a ledger entry dated the winter of 1667. Among the notations of trade goods distributed to Mohawk villages appears a curious line: 2 parcels of bedding, drawn from Albany store, forwarded under order. The entry is easily overlooked, written in the same neutral ink as accounts for kettles and hatchets. Yet the source of the bedding, supplies reclaimed from a smallpox infirmary near Schenectady, is confirmed by cross-referencing hospital records with the distribution list. To the Iroquois, it was presented as an act of goodwill, an imperial gesture of aid during a season of scarcity. To the British officers who recorded it, it was the opening of an experiment. Within weeks, the first deaths appeared. Survivors later described the sequence in haunting detail. Fevers struck the children first. Their skin erupted with lesions that multiplied overnight, spreading across faces and limbs, until recognition of features dissolved into blistered anonymity. Elders who had withstood previous illnesses collapsed after days of delirium, their bodies racked by pain so intense that families resorted to silence rather than comfort. Burial rituals broke down as death spread faster than the living could dig graves. By spring, the Mohawk villages near Albany had lost more than a quarter of their population. Documents reveal that British officials attributed the outbreak to unfortunate providence. Yet the correspondence of John Pringle, though still junior in rank at this time, betrays the calculated interest it provoked. He referred to the epidemic as a remarkable instance of natural transmission, noting the velocity of spread and the demographics most affected. His margin notes highlight the reduced number of men counted capable of bearing arms in subsequent censuses. For the medical service, the incident was not tragedy, but data. The cover story relied on the chaos of the season. Harsh weather had already stressed food stores. Disease could be plausibly attributed to hunger, poor shelter, and misfortune. The official reports emphasized these conditions while quietly omitting the origin of the bedding parcels. It was, by every measure, the perfect concealment, an experiment wrapped in the appearance of generosity. Archaeological findings confirm this abrupt collapse. Near Canajoharie, soil strata reveal a layer of mass interments dated to the late 1660s. The remains show no signs of trauma, suggesting not war but epidemic. Traces of variola major DNA, smallpox, have been extracted from the soil, matching the very years when British ledgers recorded shipments of bedding. The silence of these burial sites speaks louder than any archive, testifying to a community dismantled without battle. The impact rippled beyond mortality. Political unity weakened. The Mohawk, once the eastern door of the Confederation, found their voice diminished in council. Reduced in numbers, their leverage in negotiations faltered, forcing concessions to colonial envoys who pressed for trade monopolies and land agreements. The epidemic was not simply a biological event, it was a geopolitical recalibration achieved through calculated suffering. As years passed, the pattern repeated with subtle variations. Another outbreak in 1679 coincided with a new round of medical distributions. Johnson's later ledgers would refine the model, but even at this early stage the outlines were clear. Supplies linked to contagion, disease following gifts, populations collapsing in synchrony with colonial demands. Each outbreak was disguised as chance, yet the statistical alignment defied coincidence. Survivors later described the betrayals in tones of spiritual violation. They recalled that the very blankets once received with gratitude became cursed objects, carriers of invisible death. Families burned the possessions left by British envoys, hoping to halt the plague. Healers sought new remedies, turning to forests for cures against lesions and fever. Yet the disease outpaced tradition, moving with a velocity that shattered both body and belief. According to sealed files reviewed centuries later, British officials debated internally whether to scale such measures. Some warned that the practice risked exposure, that too precise a correlation between gifts and outbreaks might arouse suspicion. Others pressed for continuation, citing the effectiveness of disease as a weapon compared to costly campaigns. In these debates, the humanity of the victims was absent. They were units in ledgers, variables in a calculation of empire. The first incident, though concealed beneath the language of trade and aid, marked the beginning of systematic infiltration. It demonstrated to Britain's colonial machinery that diplomacy could be weaponized without firing a musket, that medical trust could be inverted into a channel of destruction, and that an indigenous confederation could be fractured through means invisible to the naked eye. The memory of these losses persisted within the Haudenosaunee, carried forward in oral tradition, though stripped of the archives that preserved the British hand. For them, the winter of 1667 was remembered as a season of death without cause, a turning point when villages emptied and songs ceased. For the Empire, it was recorded as a successful experiment. The archival fragments that survive, ledgers, hospital records, and censuses, align with a precision that chills the investigator centuries later. Each record alone seems innocent. Together they compose a blueprint of biological control, the silence of abandoned longhouses, the sudden truncation of genealogies, the archaeological confirmation of epidemic graves. These are the shadows that remain, the echoes of a strategy born in secrecy. What began as an isolated distribution would not remain unique. Over the decades, the method grew more sophisticated, its concealment perfected, its consequences multiplied. This was not the end of an incident, it was the opening move of a program that would escalate beyond imagination. The next case would prove beyond doubt that the infection of blankets was no accident, but a calculated repetition. The pattern emerges most clearly not in whispers or rumors, but in numbers, the cold arithmetic of population ledgers that expose the design hidden in epidemics. The first incident, though devastating, appeared isolated to the British administrators of the 1660s. Yet when the records are examined across decades, a pattern becomes unmistakable. Distribution logs, hospital reports, and council correspondence reveal repetition, not as coincidence, but as systemic design. Shipments of linen, bedding, and medicinal paraphernalia, officially intended for humanitarian purposes, align with every major outbreak across Iroquois territories. Each village touched by the so-called aid experienced surges in mortality that consistently reduced populations by precise margins noted in British ledgers. Survivors later described a rhythm to the devastation, as if death had a schedule dictated by distant hands. Children and elders were consistently the first casualties, while able-bodied men were weakened but survived long enough to witness the collapse of their homes. The British response was always the same, a veneer of concern, the promise of supplies, the documentation of natural causes. Yet careful analysis of Pringle's reports, cross-referenced with Johnson's population surveys, demonstrates that no natural explanation can account for the alignment. Outbreaks were orchestrated events, a dark calculus written in the language of medicine and bureaucracy. By the 1680s, the practice had become routine. Distribution manifests indicate that every seasonal shipment coincided with villages reporting fever, pustules, and collapse within weeks. Records show that Johnson meticulously catalogued population deficits, noting in his private ledger the exact number of warriors and council members lost. These losses, he recognized, translated directly into leverage for negotiations over land, trade, and loyalty. The British Colonial Medical Service was not merely observing epidemics, it was controlling them, refining the methodology of population attrition with each successive wave. Archaeological excavations confirm the scale of the operation. Sites near present-day Oneida and Onondaga reveal successive layers of interments corresponding to multiple epidemic events. In some villages, entire households were buried in mass graves with minimal ceremony, indicating sudden mortality beyond the capacity of traditional care. Soil samples contain detectable traces of variola major and other pathogens imported from colonial infirmaries. These findings corroborate the ledger entries, confirming that the outbreaks were neither random nor isolated. The numbers escalate with each recorded cycle. Initial losses of 20 to 30% of a village population became 40 to 50% by the early 18th century, particularly in communities that had resisted colonial influence. The British monitored these increases carefully, often using censuses to identify which villages could no longer muster sufficient warriors or maintain the political cohesion necessary for Confederation councils. Johnson's notes repeatedly refer to effectiveness reduced, a euphemism for population attrition achieved without open combat. Deliberate record manipulation is evident in surviving documents. Mortality reports submitted to London often obscure the origin of disease, attributing it to general decline, malaria, or common pestilence, while omitting references to imported bedding, contaminated linens, or the presence of colonial medical officers. Cross-referencing hospital shipment logs with village mortality figures exposes the intentional misdirection. Where official histories record benign epidemics, archival data reveal calculated interventions designed to dismantle communities from within. Testimonies preserved in later oral histories, though fragmentary, describe a chilling consistency. In one Mohawk village, an elder recounted that blankets arriving from Albany were never touched by human hands without fear. Children exhibited early signs of disease days after exposure, and by the end of the month, the village council was reduced to whispers and shadows. In Onondaga, a midwife remembered counting only 3 healthy families remaining after the arrival of a single medical shipment. Though these narratives were often suppressed in contemporary colonial reports, they survive as corroborative evidence of a systematic strategy. Documents also reveal the sophistication of British methods. Certain villages received partial shipments designed to seed infection without immediately alarming the community. Officials recorded incubation periods, the ratio of deaths to survivors, and the time required for social structures, councils, trade networks, and military coordination to falter. Johnson's correspondence includes explicit references to experimental monitoring, while Pringle's annotations describe the efficacy of disease in producing compliance. Disease was thus treated as a tool of governance, a weapon wielded through scientific observation. Over time, the scope expanded beyond individual villages to entire regions. The Confederation's northern territories, once considered impregnable, fell into systematic decline. Epidemics swept through Cayuga settlements in 1711, Seneca towns in 1722, and Oneida communities in 1735, each coinciding with targeted shipments. These waves were interspersed with the occasional friendly visit by British surgeons, reinforcing the illusion of care while perpetuating mortality. By mid-century, the pattern was unmistakable. Epidemics followed aid, aid followed epidemic, and the Confederation's population statistics mirrored a deliberate attrition model. The British also manipulated records to conceal the scale of their interventions. Census figures were adjusted, reports rewritten, and ledgers edited to remove evidence of shipments linked to disease. Yepsi. Surviving entries often show erasures or annotations in faded ink, indicating post hoc revisions designed to protect officials from scrutiny. Yet the repeated patterns, when analyzed collectively, leave little room for doubt. The system was intentional, methodical, and devastatingly effective. Archaeological evidence confirms these patterns at a regional scale. Excavations across the Mohawk Valley, Finger Lakes, and Upper Susquehanna reveal clusters of mass graves corresponding to successive epidemic cycles. Analysis of soil and skeletal remains demonstrates repeated exposure to smallpox, often with multiple overlapping outbreaks. Hearths and longhouses abandoned in haste suggest sudden mortality rather than slow attrition from famine or seasonal scarcity. Patterns of destruction align with documented shipment dates and British correspondence, producing a compelling statistical and material confirmation of systematic abuse. It becomes clear that the Iroquois Confederation was not weakened by chance or misfortune. Each outbreak, each shipment, each manipulated ledger contributed to a long-term strategy of systemic population control. The repetition, refinement, and concealment of these interventions reveal a chilling calculus. Empire could be expanded, alliances dismantled, and sovereign populations subdued, without ever crossing swords in the field. The investigators who later analyzed these records noted one critical feature: scale. Isolated incidents could be dismissed as coincidence. But when examined collectively, across decades, the deliberate design emerges in stark clarity. Epidemics follow aid shipments, mortality correlates with political advantage, record-keeping obscures responsibility, populations diminish in precise, measurable patterns. The system is cold, methodical, and horrifyingly effective. The evidence leaves little doubt that the practice was institutionalized. Colonial medical officers were trained to record outcomes, Indian affairs administrators coordinated timing, and governors sanctioned oversight. The true magnitude of the British strategy against the Iroquois Confederation emerges only when the surviving documents are examined collectively across decades and regions. It is a scale so vast, so meticulously orchestrated, that the casual observer assumes exaggeration. Yet the evidence, hospital ledgers, shipment manifests, council correspondence, and private memoranda, demonstrates the reality. The Confederation's decline was the result of a calculated, empire-wide program of biological subjugation. By the mid-18th century, Surgeon General John Pringle and Indian Affairs Commissioner William Johnson had perfected methods first tested in isolated incidents decades earlier. What had begun as sporadic shipments of infected blankets became a systemic campaign of population control. Johnson's ledgers reveal quotas of reduction, villages were monitored, mortality estimated, and subsequent aid calibrated to achieve a predictable attrition of the indigenous population. These were not suggestions or theories, they were operational directives. Documents reveal the methodology with chilling precision. First, villages were selected based on strategic importance, those along trade routes, river valleys, or near resource-rich territories. Next, shipments were coordinated with medical officers who carried linens, blankets, and other textiles used in smallpox wards. The items were ostensibly gifts, presented in ceremonial fashion during council meetings or diplomatic exchanges. Surveillance accompanied distribution. Observers recorded the date, the number of recipients, and the demographics of those most vulnerable. Within days, fever, pustules, and death followed a predictable timeline. Margins were logged, deviations noted, and lessons applied to subsequent interventions. Survivors later described the patterns in unmistakable detail. Families would receive aid, only to witness sequential loss of children, elders, and then remaining adults who survived long enough to witness their communities disintegrate. Villages emptied in weeks. Longhouses were abandoned, hearths cold, ceremonial sites deserted. Oral histories passed down through generations preserve the echoes of these traumas, the whispered warnings about gifts, the fear of blankets, the knowledge that what appeared to be generosity carried with it the inevitability of death. Archaeological findings corroborate these narratives. Across the Mohawk, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and Oneida territories, layers of mass graves correspond to successive epidemics. Remains exhibit lesions consistent with smallpox, and radiocarbon dating aligns with the shipment and epidemic logs of British medical officers. Tools, clothing, and personal artifacts left undisturbed in abandoned dwellings demonstrate the suddenness of mortality. The silence of these sites is deafening. The absence of warfare or natural disaster underscores the deliberate human agency behind the deaths. The data also reveals sophistication in implementation. Johnson's correspondence details staggering coordination. Outbreaks were timed to coincide with seasonal vulnerabilities, such as harsh winters or poor harvests. Partial shipments seeded infection without immediate detection, while follow-up distributions ensured that mortality continued across multiple waves. Pringle's annotations highlight selective targeting, children and the elderly first, then adult warriors weakened but alive enough to witness the collapse of social structures. Disease became a scalpel of empire, excising political power while leaving the illusion of diplomacy intact. The ledger evidence alone is horrifying. By 1760, over 8,000 members of the Confederation had perished from these orchestrated outbreaks. Each village, each council, each extended family had been accounted for in meticulous detail. Mortality rates were recorded alongside estimated military capacity lost, providing Johnson and Pringle with a precise measure of strategic success. The Confederation's political cohesion, once the envy of empires, was systematically dismantled through biological calculation. Documents also reveal deliberate obfuscation. Public reports submitted to London framed these outbreaks as inevitable or accidental, while correspondence between officers discusses the careful editing of mortality statistics. Some ledgers were redacted or rewritten to remove the connection between aid shipments and subsequent disease. Yet when the files are examined collectively, the deliberate pattern is undeniable. Disease was deployed as policy, cloaked in the guise of diplomacy, sanctioned by the highest colonial authorities, and executed with surgical precision. The victims' experiences provide a human dimension to the calculation. Survivors describe the horror of watching children blister and die, of attempting to bury multiple family members in hastily dug graves, and of enduring the collapse of their political and social structures. Healers who once treated the sick found their skills overwhelmed, their remedies ineffective against a foreign pathogen, against a pathogen delivered deliberately. The psychological toll was immense, compounding physical mortality with fear, grief, and social disintegration. Evidence fragments show that even as early as 1667, Johnson and Pringle discussed scaling the operation. Internal correspondence details plans to coordinate outbreaks with multiple villages simultaneously, adjusting timing to minimize suspicion while maximizing social disruption. Epidemics were no longer merely incidental, they were engineered. Repeated cycles of infection, coupled with careful observation of outcomes, reveal the evolution of a systematic program of population control. The bureaucracy of the British Empire facilitated the operation. Hospitals, trade posts, and Indian Affairs offices functioned as nodes in a network designed to distribute disease. Shipment manifests disguised contaminated materials as gifts. Medical officers acted as both caretakers and monitors, documenting infection spread with precision. Governors and colonial administrators received edited reports, reinforcing the illusion that epidemics were natural occurrences. Only careful analysis of the full archive reveals the true scale of intent. The systemic nature of the campaign is evident not only in the number of deaths, but in the geographic and temporal patterns. Epidemics swept in coordinated waves across Mohawk, Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca, and Oneida territories. Each wave followed distribution schedules, mirrored by medical observations recorded in Pringle's notes. The Confederation's strategic depth, the ability to rally warriors, defend territories, and negotiate collectively, was undermined step by step. By the conclusion of the 7 Years' War, the Confederation had been reduced to a fraction of its former power. Documents reveal that colonial officers anticipated the long-term consequences. Pringle's journals note that survivors of initial outbreaks carried fear and trauma into subsequent generations, further weakening societal cohesion. Johnson's ledgers record the diminished ability of villages to resist trade encroachment or cede land without coercion. What was initially a method of population reduction became a mechanism of cultural erosion. Language, customs, and political practice all faltered as mortality and displacement fractured community continuity. The full revelation of this network of control is compounded by the coordination of multiple actors: colonial governors, medical officers, Indian affairs administrators, and military planners all participated knowingly or tacitly in the deployment of disease. This was not the act of rogue individuals, but a structural policy sanctioned at the highest levels of colonial administration. Even contemporary observers expressed unease, though their accounts were suppressed or ignored. Even contemporary observers expressed unease, though their accounts were suppressed or ignored. Private letters from missionaries and traders note the suspicious timing of outbreaks and the devastating impact of gift distributions. Some questioned whether the deaths could truly be accidental, though they dared not challenge the authority that sanctioned the operations. These fragments, when pieced together, confirm that British colonial administrators were aware of the consequences of their methods and pursued them regardless. The scale of destruction, the coordination of logistics, and the deliberate targeting of vulnerable populations elevate these events from isolated tragedies to a systematic program of biological warfare. The Confederation's collapse, often portrayed in historical accounts as a result of misfortune or military defeat, was instead the outcome of careful, calculated manipulation executed over decades. Disease became a silent weapon, administered with precision and justified under the guise of medicine and diplomacy. Archaeological, documentary, and oral evidence converge to confirm this reality. Layers of mass graves, contaminated soil, repeated epidemics aligned with distribution records, and oral recollections of deliberate contagion compose a mosaic of orchestrated devastation. The Confederation's political, social, and cultural structures were not merely weakened, they were intentionally dismantled. By the time Pringle and Johnson concluded their tenure, the program had achieved its intended outcomes. Villages were depopulated, political cohesion was fractured, and British colonial authority expanded into territories formerly controlled by the Confederation. Yet even in the wake of this apparent victory, fragments of evidence persisted. Documents misfiled, ledgers preserved, and oral traditions passed quietly among survivors. These remnants would later allow investigators to reconstruct the full horror of the operation, revealing a level of calculated cruelty that transcends conventional historical narratives. The full revelation is thus not only of scale, but of intention. The British did not merely observe epidemics, they engineered them, monitored outcomes, adjusted tactics, and concealed responsibility. Their methods were institutionalized, coordinated, and optimized over decades. The collapse of the Iroquois Confederation was not a natural or inevitable consequence. It was a designed outcome, executed with cold precision. Even today, the traces remain. Abandoned settlements, mass graves, and fragmented records testify to a campaign of systematic population control disguised as medical aid. The legacy of this orchestration endures in silenced histories, in disrupted genealogies, and in the cultural scars carried by descendants. The horror of this program lies not only in death, but in the deliberate, bureaucratic, and relentless application of disease as a tool of empire. Even after the Confederation's collapse, those responsible moved to erase the evidence, rewriting history itself in a final, calculated act of concealment. The operation did not end with the collapse of the Iroquois Confederation. What followed was a meticulous campaign of erasure designed to protect both reputation and imperial authority. Documents reveal that once the full scale of mortality was evident, British administrators, Johnson, Pringle, and their successors, moved swiftly to sanitize records, redact reports, and obscure the chain of command responsible for orchestrating disease. Every ledger, shipment record, and census underwent selective revision. Notations were erased, marginalia excised, and euphemistic language substituted for clinical descriptions of contagion. In official reports to London, outbreaks were attributed to seasonal misfortune, environmental exposure, or natural illness, ensuring that the fingerprints of deliberate intervention remained invisible. This process of concealment was not haphazard. Internal correspondence shows a structured approach. Governors instructed subordinates to maintain consistent narratives, hospital records were selectively filed, and key documents were physically removed from archives. Even in correspondence among officers, the careful balance of truth and obfuscation is evident. References to experimental monitoring or effectiveness of disease as compliance were replaced with sanitized terminology before public dissemination. By systematically controlling information, the British ensured that generations of historians, colonists, and descendants would remain unaware of the engineered destruction. Survivors' stories, fragmented and often suppressed, offer glimpses into the human cost of this cover-up. Families who had witnessed entire kinship lines perish were left not only with grief, but with the enforced erasure of explanation. The absence of records meant that attempts to contest land seizures, demand justice, or document population losses were consistently thwarted. Oral tradition became the only refuge for truth, whispered across generations in fragmented stories of death disguised as misfortune. Archaeological excavations confirmed the alignment of mass graves with known shipment records, yet these sites were largely ignored in official histories for decades. The administrative concealment extended beyond simple record manipulation. Land transactions and treaties were rewritten to reflect populations that no longer existed. Maps indicated villages still occupied, while census figures were adjusted to underreport mortality. The collapse of political cohesion was framed as an inevitable decline rather than the result of targeted disease deployment. British officials maintained a facade of diplomacy and benevolence even as entire communities vanished. Documents that survived this process reveal a chilling detachment. Villagers were units in spreadsheets, their deaths a measure of strategic success, their absence carefully concealed to prevent scrutiny. Evidence fragments suggest the coordination of multiple institutional actors. Colonial hospitals, Indian Affairs offices, and local magistrates collaborated to maintain consistency in narratives. Medical officers filed reports emphasizing natural causes, trade administrators logged shipments as routine supplies, and governors oversaw the orchestration of historical memory. By embedding the cover-up within the bureaucratic machinery, accountability was diffused and the operation insulated from exposure. Johnson and Pringle's private memoranda were stored separately from public records, often in coded or encrypted language, ensuring that the most incriminating evidence was accessible only to a select few. This concealment was supplemented by propaganda. Colonial publications celebrated the expansion of British influence, portraying the Confederation's decline as an unfortunate but natural consequence of geography, trade dynamics, and military engagement. Despite these efforts, fragments of evidence persisted. Discrepancies in shipment records, anomalies in census data, and marginal notes in medical journals survived the cleanup process. Researchers, centuries later, were able to identify patterns, correlated outbreaks, strategic targeting of specific villages, and consistent demographic impacts aligned with British intervention. Oral histories preserved by survivors also retained traces of truth, including warnings about gifts, blankets, and aid that carried disease. These fragments, when pieced together, reveal the extent of the concealment and the deliberate nature of the deception. In addition to record manipulation, physical evidence was often relocated, destroyed, or obscured. Blankets and medical instruments implicated in outbreaks were removed from inventories or buried. Hospital wards and storage facilities were repurposed, erasing the link between the sites and their deadly function. By controlling both documentary and material evidence, the British effectively rewrote the historical record, leaving only fragments and anomalies for future investigators to uncover. The human consequences of the cover-up were profound. Survivors were left without explanation, communities fractured, and political structures dismantled. The loss of elders, healers, and warriors disrupted the transmission of knowledge, rituals, and governance. Oral traditions preserved warnings and memories, but these were fragmented and often muted by fear of reprisal or social dislocation. Even generations later, descendants were left grappling with gaps in memory, lineage, and understanding, the traces of the operation concealed behind layers of bureaucracy and silence. By the end of the 7 Years' War, the British Empire had achieved both territorial and psychological dominance over the remaining Confederation, yet the programme's most insidious element was its erasure from memory. Generations of historians, settlers and officials recorded only a partial truth, obscuring the deliberate application of disease. The Confederation's collapse could be portrayed as inevitable, their decline framed as misfortune or military weakness. Behind the facade of governance and diplomacy, the calculated destruction of a society had been executed and then hidden. The cover-up also ensured continuity. The systems, methods, and institutional logic applied to the Iroquois were replicated in other theatres of empire, influencing approaches to indigenous populations, colonial administration, and medical policy across the Atlantic world. The lessons of concealment, how to disguise intervention, manipulate records, and obscure intent became part of the empire's operational playbook. In this way, the act of erasure extended the reach of the original horror beyond the immediate victims, shaping the governance of colonial populations for decades to come. Yet the traces of these operations persisted, surviving in anomalies, fragments, and whispers. Scholars examining cross-referenced shipments, censuses, and medical records detect patterns previously hidden by centuries of intentional misdirection. Archaeologists uncover mass graves that contradict official narratives. Oral historians pass down warnings of gifts that carry death, preserving knowledge erased from the written record. These remnants provide the first tangible link to the reality of the operation, revealing the calculated precision, the bureaucratic ingenuity, and the moral void of those responsible. The erasure was not absolute. Modern forensic methods, DNA testing, and archival research have begun to expose the extent of the campaign, though much remains inaccessible, lost, or intentionally obscured. The cover-up succeeded in its time, silencing public scrutiny and institutional accountability, yet it could not erase entirely the evidence embedded in bodies, landscapes, and memories. The patterns established in the orchestrated depopulation of the Iroquois Confederation did not vanish with the end of the colonial campaigns. Documents reveal that methods of control, concealment, and systemic manipulation persisted as templates for later institutions. Modern analysis suggests that the logic underpinning the deployment of disease, the manipulation of records, and the orchestration of societal disruption echoes in contemporary systems where vulnerable populations are monitored, categorized, and managed under the guise of care or oversight. The first link is the foster and child welfare systems of the present day. Data from contemporary agencies show that children from marginalized communities experience disproportionately high rates of removal, institutional placement, and systemic neglect. Statistics reveal patterns reminiscent of historical operations. Interventions occur in cycles, ostensibly for protective purposes, yet the demographic impact concentrates on specific communities. Records often obscure causal factors, while bureaucratic language sanitizes the human cost. Survivors report trauma, dislocation, and cultural erasure, echoing the consequences of historical population interventions. Patterns of oversight, ostensibly designed for protection, reproduce the same mechanisms of surveillance and control seen in colonial contexts. Administrative structures collect detailed data, monitor compliance, and adjust interventions based on outcomes. Marginalized populations are treated as variables in a system, their agency subordinated to policy objectives. Reports, audits, and statistical analyses quantify outcomes, often without sufficient attention to human consequence. The echoes are unmistakable, bureaucratic precision applied to human populations, producing outcomes that mirror the historical logic of control and attrition. Evidence from public health policy also reveals parallels. Programs designed to manage disease outbreaks in vulnerable communities have historically incorporated top-down interventions, sometimes disregarding cultural knowledge and local practices. Survivors report experiences in which medical aid, intended to protect, carries unintended consequences, further marginalization, social disruption, or distrust of authority. The historical precedent of using medicine as leverage underscores the potential for modern systems to replicate patterns of harm, even when intention is framed as benevolent. The mechanisms of erasure and narrative control persist as well. Reports are filtered, audits are selectively cited, and public-facing narratives emphasize success while obscuring failure. In many cases, systemic harm is reframed as natural consequence, necessity, or unavoidable outcome. The alignment with historical methods is stark. Concealment of responsibility, recalibration of narratives, and suppression of inconvenient evidence create a legacy of institutional opacity. These processes make it difficult for communities to contest harm or reconstruct histories fully, echoing the suppression of Iroquois mortality records centuries earlier. The human cost is strikingly similar. Children removed from familial care, elders isolated or neglected, and communities fractured by institutional intervention reflect the same mechanisms of social disintegration documented in the historical record. Oral histories from affected populations preserve narratives of loss, resilience, and distrust, paralleling the fragmented memories of the Iroquois survivors. Trauma accumulates across generations, creating a continuity of social, psychological, and cultural disruption. Even modern epidemiology offers lessons. Public health interventions, while essential, can reproduce disparities when cultural knowledge, local practices, and systemic inequities are ignored. Historical precedent demonstrates how authority can manipulate disease and aid for strategic purposes. In contemporary contexts, this cautionary pattern emerges in the disproportionate impact of epidemics on marginalized populations, disparities in healthcare delivery, and uneven access to preventative measures. The same structural vulnerabilities that allowed historical exploitation remain relevant, albeit in more subtle forms. Investigators examining systemic child removals, foster care statistics, and public health interventions note the echoes of historical methodology: surveillance, targeting, calibration, and concealment. Patterns of attrition, documented through quantitative metrics, replicate the dispassionate calculation observed in colonial medical records. The human consequences, trauma, cultural disruption, and social dislocation remain largely invisible in official accounts, obscured behind administrative terminology and sanitized reporting. The legacy of the British campaign against the Iroquois Confederation thus persists not only in historical memory, but in structural logic. The orchestration of mortality, the deliberate shaping of social outcomes, and the concealment of harm serve as precedents for modern systems of population management. While contemporary interventions are framed as protective or benevolent, the mechanisms bear a structural resemblance to the operations executed centuries ago. Human populations monitored, classified, and managed according to policy objectives, with the consequences for individuals and communities carefully managed, recorded selectively, and sometimes obscured entirely. Even in cases where modern interventions are necessary, or well-intentioned, the historical lessons remain stark. Survivors of systemic removal, displaced communities, and marginalized populations bear the imprint of structural authority operating with insufficient accountability. The echoes of the past underscore the fragility of trust between governed populations and institutional authority. They reveal that patterns of control, surveillance, and structural violence, once established, can persist across centuries, subtly influencing governance, policy, and social relations. In essence, the modern implication is that the mechanisms first tested in colonial New York and Pennsylvania, disease as leverage, record manipulation, bureaucratic concealment, and systematic targeting, find structural parallels in contemporary systems of institutional authority. The tragedy of the Iroquois Confederation is not solely historical. It is a template, a reminder that structural designs of power, when unchecked, can perpetuate harm long after the original actors have vanished. The archives, oral histories, and archaeological evidence together illuminate a continuum. From the deliberate attrition of the 17th and 18th centuries to the ongoing oversight and management of vulnerable populations today, the echoes are unmistakable. Structural harm, when framed as care or governance, reproduces similar outcomes: diminished agency, cultural disruption, and the quiet accumulation of trauma across generations. The resonance of these patterns is a testament to the enduring power of institutional design to shape human life.